Now, I would like to go through a couple of use cases which are powered by Aerospike in the context of retail and e-commerce. The first one is in the context of fraud prevention. This is a card not present scenario wherein the payment transaction is actually getting done. In this case, the biggest challenge is, like I mentioned earlier, from an SLA standpoint, when the user is actually online and trying to go ahead and initiate a transaction, in that fraction of a millisecond, you would want to go ahead and determine whether this transaction is a fraud or not a fraud. And in this case, this customer was actually kind of getting trouble with the false positives. What it means is they're trying to go ahead and then categorize most of the transactions as fraud transactions while they're not, right? And that's a loss of business for the retailer. So in this case, the whole thing was to go ahead and then determine while the purchase process is in line to whether the transaction is fraud or not. They had quite a good amount of infrastructure before Aerospike was deployed. In this case, it happened to be Oracle RAC cluster, 2 huge Oracle RAC clusters, and then 360 Terracotta servers, which were front-ending Oracle RAC to go ahead and then catch up with the speed, and that was actually kind of scaling up pretty heavily in terms of the cost. And that is a typical pattern that the current e-commerce companies and the retailers do. However, what we have done is, with Aerospike, given its response times and given its speed, the whole 360 Terracotta servers were actually brought down to 20 servers, significantly bringing down the infrastructure costs. And of course, predominantly in terms of the whole operation expenditure as well. And the most important aspect is the predictability of response times in terms of coming out with whether it is a fraud or not. And in the context of 750 milliseconds is the kind of an entire expected response time between deciding whether this transaction is a fraud or not a fraud transaction, and that was completely predictable for this customer. And that's a significant thing for them. So that kind of saves almost every single transaction that is actually processed through with a higher confidence rate in terms of identifying whether it's a fraud or not. The second case is Snapdeal. It's India's largest online marketplace. India, by itself, having a population over 1 billion, you mentioned about seasonality, Suchirita. In cases of festival seasons, what happens is there is a huge amount of inflow in terms of the transaction, and for the marketplace, it is very important in terms of keeping up the systems to be extremely available, and at the same time, the price reflections have to happen instantaneously across the servers, across the places of actually access for these the online marketplace, and the pricing, the dynamic pricing, catching up with the other competition, plus the deals that actually have to be updated. All of this had to happen in real time during the seasonality aspects of it. So that was a bigger problem for this customer. They were using Mongo, front-ended with cache, which was significantly kind of hurting their business more in terms of not able to catch up with the speeds that they were actually looking at it. And that's where Aerospike got deployed, to go ahead and keep up into the 5 millisecond response time that they were actually looking at to go ahead and then put the entire set of things from an experience perspective, whether it is catalog search, whether it's pricing, and the rating experiences that they were actually trying to go and show as a part of the marketplace. The third one is US-based, furniture retailer. It's one of the top internet services retailers. It does about $4 billion in e-commerce. In this case, there's an interesting aspect to it, right? So what these guys were actually looking at was more in terms of how do you bring in the real-time recommendations for the users who come onto their site to purchase the furniture. It's basically for cross-selling and upselling. Right, and this was being done based on the behavioral analytics, right, and based on how many clicks they've done and how they go through the journey of the browsing, their external behavior in terms of which is actually brought in from multiple sources of data. All of that was being understood and then pushed it to the machine learning, and they were trying to go ahead and do the recommendations. However, the biggest bottleneck that they were actually getting into was using the Redis and Memcache system. The amount of data that they were able to go ahead and operate on was single-digit terabyte data. I mean, that was the kind of a limitation that the systems were actually getting hit up with. Now, what does that mean? So that means the amount, the type, the accuracy of recommendations, like I mentioned earlier, the more amount of data that you actually statistically kind of can glean on and then crunch on, the more the accurate recommendations are. And in this case, the recommendations were kind of falling far from the tree, so to say, and that was the biggest problem for them. So from where we got in, and then Aerospike was deployed, and in this case, now they're able to bring in from single-digit terabytes to about 30 terabytes right now, and then very quickly getting into 75 terabytes onto the edge. And that is a significant impact in the business, because they're able to go ahead and significantly raise the accuracy of the recommendations by crunching the data in real time and get like 30 terabytes of data in real time, right? So that's the biggest advantage for them. And all of that was in about like close to 1/8 of the server footprint, which is significantly lower in infrastructure, and that's what we're actually seeing with many other customers as well. The other case which I want to go ahead and quickly touch upon is digital marketing in real time. You did touch upon in terms of how the marketing campaigns can go through, and how do you target the customers in real time. Many of our customers, what we have seen is they do want to have the advertising run on their pages when the users land up. They do want to go ahead and make the ad revenues as well. So in that context, when the ads are being run, and Aerospike significantly dominates that market, ad tech and martech market, it is deployed across the customers, specifically for the session profile store and the cookie store, wherein the response times are expected to be under 100 milliseconds, and anywhere between 100 to 300 milliseconds response time windows, and that's where exactly they use Aerospike to go ahead and scale up. The final point which I actually want to touch upon is pricing data layer simplification. So you did mention about dynamic pricing. Typically what we have seen with retailers is this is a kind of a standard pattern that they go ahead and deploy is to have two different types of systems which are fully stacked up. One is used for during the daytime. Other one does in the nighttime. So the whole synchronization happens in nighttime, and then you have like kind of flip-flop between alternate days to bring up the systems in sync. And that is a significant problem for the online retailing and e-commerce perspective, because it's always on. You can't go ahead and do that. And that's the one fundamental area where we see more in terms of Aerospike getting deployed as well. Simplifying the entire architecture into simple database that can cover all the caching complexity and synchronization problems from a day to nighttime systems. So this kind of helps in a real-time pricing and promotions without having the complexity of switching the entire stack between day and night. Okay. The key takeaways for real-time machine learning in e-commerce, of course, like you mentioned, and from a technical standpoint, it has to be consistent, repeatable, SLA adherence. That's the biggest thing, which makes a significant difference in terms of the customer experience. The second thing, which is there is, like I mentioned, most of the cases that we have been seeing is the more the data that is there brought into the edge for the AI and machine learning, the more accuracy it is. And then the third point, which is there is all of these, when you talk about bringing the more data into the edge, which is driven predominantly by in-memory systems, and memory is actually expensive, and that doesn't have to be in the way that Aerospike is actually architectured. Given that it's hybrid memory, it brings down the cost significantly, and that is where the lower TCO that we bring in. So these are the key takeaways that we see from a real-time machine learning, and why we're getting adopted so significantly in the e-commerce and in the retail industry.